All right, today we will be covering the respiratory system. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, so basically the respiratory system is the system that brings in and releases gases between our body and the environment, all right? So the basic plan of the respiratory system is like a tree that's been turned upside down. And if you want to think about that as, a tree turned upside down, the alveoli would be the leaves, the branches of the bronchioles would be the branches, and then the trunk would be the trachea. And we'll talk about each individual detail as we go along through this lecture. Okay, so let's first start with discussing what is the upper and what is the lower respiratory tract. So different books actually designate this a little differently. What I do is I include the upper respiratory tract, the nose, the pharynx, and the larynx. So I cut off right at the larynx, all right? So your voice box. Everything below is the lower respiratory tract. So the nasal cavity, the pharynx, which includes the nasopharynx, kind of the region connecting the back of your throat to your nasal passages. The oropharynx, which is the back of your throat, your back of your mouth, and then the laryngeal pharynx is right here, right above your larynx. Now, extending down into the lower respiratory tract, we have the trachea, the right and left primary bronchi, and then the bronchioles, which eventually branch out into the alveoli. So what's going on at a first view here of gas exchange? So let's go back one slide. All gas exchange occurs in the alveolus. So the alveoli includes the alveolar sacs and then the capillaries surrounding each alveolar sac. Here, the sacs look like little grape clusters at the end of a branch, right? So if you look at one of the grapes here, this would be one alveolus, here would be a second alveolus. Inside the alveolus, you have kind of an open space, a lumen. The alveolus is made up of very, very thin alveolar epithelial cells. So here's an epithelial cell right here, all right? But it also includes other alveolar cells, which are called type 1 and type 2 cells. Don't worry about that right now. What these cells do is they produce something called a surfactant. A surfactant is a compound, excuse me, that keeps water from building up inside of the alveolus, and that'll become important later. So right next to the alveolus, or alveoli, which is plural, you're going to have all of these capillaries, okay, these little spaces that are going to have the red blood cells passing through and surrounding each alveolus. So let's go back a slide again. Here are the capillaries surrounding the exterior of the alveolus. So if we cut it in half like this, boy, I'm never sure whether I should be using red or black or blue. I don't know. It's complicated. So you cut it, the alveolus, in half to show the interior, and these are the blood vessels. So what's happening here is oxygen and CO2 diffuse down their concentration gradients. So over here inside of the blood, okay, CO2 is high. Of course, that's not going to work for me. Let's try like fluorescent green. That might work. CO2, ooh, that does work, is high. And CO2 inside the alveolus is low. So what that means in terms of diffusion is that CO2 is going to want to go from, or it doesn't want anything because it's a molecule, but CO2 diffuses down in this case, it's actually a pressure gradient from high to low across the basement membrane through two cell layers. One, the capillary endothelial cell, and number two, the alveolar, sorry, my pencil looks a little weird from where I'm sitting. Two, right here, the alveolar epithelial cell. The opposite happens for oxygen. So we'll try light blue. Oxygen is high inside of the alveolus, all right, because you've just breathed in air. And oxygen is low inside the capillary and actually very low on the red blood cell. So oxygen diffuses across the alveolar epithelium and across the capillary epithelium to attach itself onto the hemoglobin molecules of the red blood cells. And in this way, you have the transport of CO2, which remember is a waste product, right? CO2 is a waste product. Transporting it out of your body and you breathe it out. Oxygen, on the other hand, which is a nutrient, okay, R-I-E-N-T, sorry, it's so hard to write on these boards. Oxygen, which is a nutrient, you breathe in and it charges up your red blood cells. So as we breathe in and out, we're transporting out waste and breathing in a nutrient. How awesome is that, right? So cool. So what about the tissues lining the entire respiratory pathway? The respiratory mucosa is that kind of epithelial layer covered in mucus, right? You guys sometimes, especially when it's like there are a lot of pollens around, you're always clearing your throat. One of the reasons why you do that is because the respiratory mucosa produces about, well, more than, especially here in Merced, 125 mils of mucus each day to form a blanket covering most of the respiratory tract. The reason is respiratory mucus helps act as an air purifier, and it traps particles that we breathe in, like dust and pollen, any sort of particulate matter that might be in the air. So if you remember here in Merced, occasionally we've had massive fires in the area. In 2020, everything, Merced, boy, 2020, what a year, right? Remember the fires that happened in down kind of near, it was past Yosemite, but there were huge fires and the smoke had blown into our area. There were also huge fires over in Santa Cruz. Smoke blew over from that area. And the sky here in Merced was orange. I could not even see the house across the street. There was so much dust and particulate matter in the air and smoke from these fires that you couldn't see the house across the street. It was really important at that point in time for this mucus blanket to cover the respiratory pathways to help keep as much dust out of those delicate alveolar sacs. Cilia, in addition to the mucosal blanket, cilia inside the respiratory tract move around and they beat in one direction. So let's say you have a bunch of cilia, it looks like little hairs, and you have a big piece of dust and you want to move it out. The cilia will wave back and forth to move that dust particle up toward your mouth, up toward your oropharynx, so you can either cough it out or swallow it with mucus. So I kind of think of this, the ciliary motion, as kind of like crowd surfing at a concert. Here's a great picture showing you a cross-section through the mucosal membrane. Here's a mucus gland producing tons of mucus. Here's the actual mucus layer here, sitting on top of the cilia, which are waving back and forth, right? Moving stuff up towards the oropharynx. How cool is that? And here's the really cool pseudostratified epithelium. Remember that when we were looking at slides and stuff earlier? Okay, so what we're going to do is start talking about the structure of each of the components of the respiratory system, and we're going to start with the nose, an external structure. It's the thing that we see on the front of everybody's face, right? The nasal septum separates the two nares, or the two kind of holes, the interior part of the nose, into two cavities. Those two cavities will be the right and the left of the patient. The mucous membrane lines the nose. So the mucous membrane goes all the way out to the edge of your nose. So I'm not going to say stick your finger in your nose, but if you've ever had to do that for any reason, it's wet in there, right? That's because that mucous membrane goes all the way down to the edge of your nasal nares and joins with the exterior epithelium. Now, nasal polyps are very common, especially in areas where there's a lot of hay fever, a lot of allergies. Nasal polyps here in Merced are common. These are growths that project out of the nasal mucosa. So they're like little bumps, like skin tags inside of your nasal epithelium, inside your nose. They're not a big deal. They're non-cancerous. However, they can kind of block airflow if they keep growing. So sometimes a ear, nose, and throat doctor, an otolaryngologist, will have to go in and clear out polyps from somebody's nasal mucosa. There are chambers that extend back, which we call sinuses. We have the frontal sinus, the maxillary, the sphenoidal, and the ethmoidal sinuses that drain, I wouldn't say into the nose. They drain into the nose if you're blowing out. If you're going in to the back of your throat, that would be draining into your pharynx. What's the point of the nose other than to look fabulous, right? It functions to warm and moisten all of the air that you inhale, and it contains osmoreceptors. It allows us to smell things. The osmoreceptors are also super important for helping us taste things. So without them, you would still taste salt, sweet, sour, but it's the smell that gives you the deliciousness of all those things. So next time you try to eat, let's say, soy sauce, plug your nose, pinch your nose, breathe through your mouth, in, out for about 30 seconds, and then taste soy sauce. It tastes super, super salty, but it doesn't taste that amino acid umami component that you'll normally have. Oh my gosh, I'm thinking of soy sauce and I'm drooling. So I yawn all the time. I also drool. I don't know. I think I was a dog in my last life. So here's an example of what the sinuses look like. The paranasal sinuses, para for like outside of, nasal, of course, for the nose. So here's what's amazing about the upper respiratory system in your face, basically. Here's the oral cavity, your mouth. We have the nares, the external nares, starting here and here. The maxillary sinuses run adjacent to the nares. Here's the right and the left respiratory pathway. The frontal sinuses occur up above your brow bone there. We have the ethmoidal air sacs right up here, the sphenoidal sinus, which is way back here, and then we have these things called tubernates. The tubernates are these kind of curls right here that when you come to Merced College, we have a beautiful, beautiful example of the tubernates and the sinuses, how they look on one of our skulls. So it's a really fun thing to look at. An endoscope is a tool that allows a doctor to look up inside of the sinuses to see if there are any polyps or disruptions. If there is, for example, a deviated septum, so here's the nasal septum right here on the left picture. If for whatever reason, let's say this poor lady was out skateboarding and she fell when she was young and broke her nose, the septum could be deviated and it could block one side of her sinuses. So sometimes doctors will have to go in and repair that type of damage. Okay, the pharynx. The pharynx is your throat. The pharynx is divided into 3 areas. The nasopharynx, which is the highest, which is way up by where the air from your nose comes in. The oropharynx, which is in the back of your throat, like that's what you touch if you stick your finger down your throat. And then the laryngopharynx, it's deeper down into your throat. I don't know if you could touch that. It would be, maybe you could, it'd be kind of gross. The 2 nasal cavities, the mouth, the esophagus, larynx, and auditory tubes also have openings into the pharynx. The auditory tubes can also be called the eustachian tubes. What else do you find in there? The pharyngeal tonsils, or the adenoids, which are close to the auditory tubes, located near the nasopharynx, and the tonsils are found in the oropharynx. And if you remember from our chapter on the lymphatic system and immunity, remember, the tonsils and the adenoids are really important in helping protect our body from things coming in, right? Well, look at where everything's coming in, your mouth and your nose. Of course it makes sense to have pharyngeal and palatine tonsils, or I guess you'd say adenoids and palatine tonsils, next to a place where stuff is always coming in. A great way to protect the body. And then, of course, mucous membranes. Mucous membranes also line the pharynx. If you just go from like the opening of your nose all the way down to the alveolus, well, maybe not the alveolus, but at least down to the bronchi, you're going to have mucous membranes. What's the point of the pharynx? It's a passageway for air coming from your nose and for food and liquids coming from your mouth, from the oropharynx. Okay, so here's an example also showing the pharyngeal regions. Right here are the pharyngeal tonsils or the adenoids. Farther back, you'll find the palatine tonsils. And then, so this is your oropharynx, respiratory pharynx, oropharynx, and laryngeal pharynx. Please pay attention to this particular picture showing you the sinuses, the sphenoidal, frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinuses, and where they lie in conjunction with the respiratory pathway. Each one of these regions here are called the concha, and the concha are pieces of tissue that lay kind of like wrap around inside of your nose and make mucus.